Hi, this is Paul Deneri, and it's time for another Ukraine Explainer because some interesting things have happened this week. Today is May 13th, Friday, and as I mentioned last week, there was an important development this past Monday, namely the Victory Day celebration in Moscow. So I want to talk about that and what we learned and what we didn't learn from that, and use that as a way of getting to a bigger discussion of what we're learning about Russian war aims, and even a little bit about what we're learning about the West's war aims, the United States and Europe, and Ukraine's war aims. I'll try to wind up with how all those things might fit together. So a bunch of moving parts here. Again, starting with the caveat that especially when we talk about Russian war aims, we're speculating. We're not taking big, clear pictures of this. We're getting little itsy-bitsy pieces of information, and we're trying to fit them together into something that makes sense. But you know, the experts, myself included, have been wrong about a lot of things here. So I just want to be clear. When I talk, I sometimes tend to sound certain about things, and I most certainly am not certain about any of this. So on Monday, Victory Day in Moscow, the big celebration to celebrate the anniversary of Germany's surrender in World War II. Talked about last time what a big deal that's become in a sort of nationalistic, militaristic propaganda sense for Vladimir Putin. And we talked about just two different things that he might say in this speech. There were some that believed he might announce a general mobilization, following the analysis that a lot of people have made that without a general mobilization, that is to say basically a draft for many, many young Russians, that without that, Russia can't put enough troops in the field to defeat the Ukrainian army as things now stand. A second thing, the opposite thing that some people were looking for, was for him to declare victory. The idea that this big patriotic event was the perfect opportunity to say we've done what we accomplished, and now we can bring our troops back home. That didn't happen. Actually, neither of those things happened. The third thing happened, which is he didn't really say anything very specific about aims in this war. But in a way, at least some people have interpreted that, and I do, in a way that tells us the fact that he didn't have something big to say means that at least for the time being, Russia is planning on carrying on as they've been doing, or at least that's what we think. It's possible not. Maybe they've got some big surprise in store, and they just weren't ready to reveal things. But based on what's been going on the ground and what Putin said in that speech, looks like they're going to continue on with this, that they think they can still make important goals. Exactly what those might be, I'll then start talking about. Related to what those other goals might be, there was an interesting development this week, and it came out of, not out of Moscow, but out of the occupation administration in the region of Kherson. Kherson is to the northwest of Crimea on the Black Sea coast, Ukrainian territory that Russia took in the early weeks of this war, forces coming up and out of Crimea supported by ships in the Black Sea. And what was interesting this week was the occupation forces in Kherson said two things. They said, number one, they said, we are going to seek annexation by Russia. Very specifically saying, we're not going to ask to be some kind of independent republic. We're going to seek to be annexed. And the second thing they said related to this was, and we're not going to do this through a referendum. We're just going to we're just going to ask Russia to annex this. Now, when they say we're asking Russia to do this, these are people who have been put in place by the government in Moscow, and so it's kind of a little bit of a charade. What this means is that Moscow is saying we're going to annex this territory. And so this is interesting in contrast to what's been going on in Donbass, where over 8 years of war in Donbass, Russia never said it wanted to annex this territory. It always kind of left it in this more nebulous status of them declaring independence from Ukraine, but not being annexed into Russia. And that partly had to do with the fact that Russia might have seen them as easier to use as a lever this way. But now in this current war, it's pretty interesting to hear Russia talk about annexing Kherson, but not Donetsk or Luhansk. What does that tell us, or why might that be so? Well, I think the big difference is that Kherson is strategically very important, whereas Donbass is not necessarily. Donbass is important in terms of fighting this war on the ground, but in the long term, it's not necessarily as valuable. Kherson is valuable to Russia for three reasons. One is it controls the water supply to Crimea. Kherson Oblast, part of what's in Kherson Oblast is a canal that runs from the southern part of the Dnipro River to Crimea. And as long as Russia was not in control of that, they were having extreme problems getting Crimea supplied with water. So presumably, in order to really make Crimea work in the long run, they want to retain that canal and the territory that surrounds it. Kherson Oblast also occupies a lot of the territory of the northern Black Sea coast, stretching westward from Crimea towards Odessa. So by itself, it would give Russia a lot more control of the Black Sea coast and Ukraine a lot less. But it equally then, sort of, and this would be the third big point, would help Russia if its goal actually is to take control of the entire northern Black Sea coast from sort of Krasnodar all the way over in Russia, what's always been Russia, all the way over to basically the border with Romania. That would give Russia sort of a foothold all the way into Eastern Europe or Southeastern Europe, and it would cut Ukraine off from the Black Sea. And there are those who think that all of this that's been going on since 2014 has been more about controlling the Black Sea than about controlling Ukraine. And the fact that Russia seems to be focusing now on Kherson as something that's going to annex and not possibly negotiate away and not give that same status to Donbass implies that. So that's what's interesting, right? If Russia annexes this territory, it's much harder then to negotiate it away because, at least in the Russian view, you're now giving away Russian territory. It's much easier to negotiate stuff away if it's these sort of temporary, unrecognized, self-declared republics. And so it begins to give us a sense of what Russia's really focused on here. And this points us to something that's kind of tragic about Donbass, about Luhansk and Donetsk, and something actually that people like me have been saying for a long time, which is while Russia made a big play to get this territory and to have it declare independence from Ukraine, and Ukraine has been fighting this on again, this sort of a low-level war for 8 years to get it back. There's also been a school of thought that I subscribe to that says neither Russia nor Ukraine really wanted this territory. Ukraine doesn't want a bunch of pro-Russian voters, and it doesn't want a bunch of decrepit old steel and coal industries that actually require quite a bit of subsidy. And from the Russian perspective, you could argue there's really not anything economically important about this territory. Maybe there's some historical significance, but economically it would be a drop in the bucket for Russia. And Russia's goal really was always to get this territory reintegrated into Ukraine, where it can be used as sort of a Russian foothold in Ukraine. So the sad thing for these territories is, besides the fact that they're having this war waged on them, and they've been having war waged on them for 8 years now, the sad thing is that it almost appears that either side is willing to negotiate them away, in contrast to some of these other territories. This gets us to the point of what an end game might look like. Is it possible that Russia would negotiate away Donbass, but not Kherson? I suspect Ukraine would feel the same way. And so this idea of annexing Kherson begins to get you to what might become a military battleground in the future as Ukraine tries to take that territory back. We heard this week from Avril Haines, the director of national intelligence in the United States, an assessment that said if Russia is desperately losing this war, Putin might deploy or use tactical nuclear weapons. This gets us very much into the realm of speculation, but Director Haynes's briefing on this is important because it gets to this question of strategy for the West. Do you want to try to decisively defeat Russia, understanding that the more decisive that defeat is, the more likely that Russia will choose to escalate? Or do you decide, or do you want to move as quickly as possible to some kind of negotiated settlement, even if that leaves Russia in control of more Ukrainian territory? And this week, I think we began to see a little bit of daylight between the United States and Europe on this. The Europeans responding really to some things that were said by Americans last week about trying to defeat the Russians. about trying to bleed the Russians. The Europeans seem to think that, again, that's the Americans being too gung-ho. So how does this all add up? As Ukraine has been more successful on the battleground, the Ukrainians have maybe gotten a little bit bolder in their war aims, right? Not just trying to end the war, but maybe trying to regain some territory. It seems like the United States is supporting Ukraine in that goal that says, let's see if we can not only sort of hold the Russians where they are, but regain some Ukrainian territory. The Europeans, I don't think, are necessarily against that, but I think are very sensitive to the notion of making sure that in the end there is some way that Vladimir Putin can declare victory. A lot of people hoped he would declare victory this past Monday, but he did not do that. And so one of the great unknowns remains what counts as victory to Putin. Is there some notion of victory for Russia that Ukraine, and then by extension the United States and Western Europe, feels that they can live with? It's not yet clear that that's the case. But I think what we learned this week is a couple of interesting things. That the Black Sea coast is maybe more important to Russia than we thought, and that eastern Ukraine, Donetsk, Luhansk, and up into Kharkiv is maybe less important than we thought. That's one interpretation. Another interpretation is it's not where those things are happening doesn't tell you what's important. It just tells you who's in control of what on the ground right now. Russia's in pretty I shouldn't say firm control, but it is in control of Kherson. It's not in control at all of Kharkiv, and it's really fighting for control of Luhansk and Donetsk. So an interesting question is, does freezing those lines kind of where they are right now, does that make the basis for some future peace? Could Russia live with that? Could Ukraine live with that? To the extent that Ukraine can't live with that, would the West continue support Ukraine, for example, perhaps as it tries to regain Kherson Oblast? These are questions that I can't answer, but I think we're going to have to focus in on increasingly as this war goes on. And again, just to recap on the battlefield, not too much dramatically changing this week. Russian forces being pushed back from Kharkiv, which is significant because it makes it harder for the Russians to shell Kharkiv, and even more so because if they get pushed back further, Ukraine may be able to begin to cut the supply lines to some of the forces that Russia is using in Luhansk Oblast and Donetsk Oblast. So I still think this war is likely to drag on for a very long time, but we may begin to see in the coming weeks the two sides showing us more signs of what's most important to them and what's less important to them. We'll see. Next week, I'll try to come back and see how things look like after another week has passed. But depending on what happens, I may wait a little bit longer until there's something really worth reporting on. So we will see you then.